When my husband and I first moved into the old duplex, we were just happy to finally afford something that wasn't falling apart. It was an aging building from the 1940s, creaky floors, thin walls, and a strange charm. The landlord told us a quiet man lived upstairs, someone who kept to himself. His name was Mr. Laird, a retired teacher in the 70s. On our first day, he left a small welcome note under our door that simply read, "Noise travels here. Please be mindful after dark." No signature, just that neat handwriting. I remember thinking it was odd but harmless. For the first few weeks, everything was fine. We heard the occasional footsteps above us, slow and deliberate, always at the same time. Around 10 p.m. Then silence. But after a while, the pattern began to change. We started hearing heavier movement, dragging sounds that went on for hours. My husband brushed it off, saying Mr. Laird was probably moving furniture. Then came the nights when we'd hear faint humming, a man's voice, tuneless, repetitive, sometimes breaking into what sounded like quiet sobbing. One evening, curiosity got the better of me. I went upstairs to knock on his door. It was slightly ajar, the chain latch still on. "Mr. Laird?" I called out. The apartment smelled faintly metallic, like rust or old pennies. There was no answer. I caught a glimpse through the gap. The living room was dark except for a single candle burning near the window. On the wall behind it, I saw something that made my stomach twist. Dozens of photographs taped in a neat grid. And in the center of all of them was a picture of me and my husband, taken through our living room window. I ran downstairs and told my husband, but when he went up to confront him, the door was locked, the lights off. We called the landlord the next morning. She frowned and said, "Mr. Laird hasn't lived there for 3 months. He passed away in June." I told her that was impossible. We'd been hearing him almost every night. But she insisted. The next night, the noises came back, footsteps pacing slowly across the floor above us. My husband grabbed a broom and pounded on the ceiling. The footsteps stopped. Then, from directly over where we stood, came 3 sharp knocks in reply. A week later, the upstairs unit was finally inspected. The maintenance man called us up after he unlocked the door. The apartment was empty, except for one thing. On the floor near the window sat a dusty candle, half melted, and a fresh photograph of us sleeping in bed. The window had been nailed shut from the inside. We moved out the next day. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I still hear those slow, deliberate footsteps above me, even though we now live in a single-story house. I rented the downstairs unit of a split-level house just outside Chicago. It was cheap, cozy, and came with a backyard, rare for my budget. The owner, Mrs. Palmer, lived upstairs. She was in her 60s, polite but distant, with that kind of Midwestern cheer that always felt a little forced. During the walkthrough, she'd said, "Oh, and don't worry about the basement door. It stays locked, just storage down there." For the first month, everything was normal. Mrs. Palmer was quiet, her footsteps soft above me. But every few nights, around 3 a.m., I'd hear her moving around, not walking, but dragging something heavy across the floor. Once, I thought I heard her humming an old lullaby. I told myself she couldn't sleep. I didn't think much of it until I came home early one evening and saw her standing outside the basement door, holding what looked like a small bundle wrapped in a towel. When she noticed me, she jumped slightly and smiled. "Just old family things," she said, tucking the bundle under her arm before locking the door again. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of that same door creaking open. I froze. Then I heard slow footsteps coming down the stairs that led directly to my side of the house. I called out, thinking maybe she needed help, but the footsteps stopped halfway. Then, after a long silence, the door slammed shut hard enough to rattle the walls. The next morning, I asked Mrs. Palmer if she'd been downstairs. Her face went pale. "No, dear." "Why?" I told her what I'd heard. She forced a laugh and said, "You must have been dreaming." But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Around midnight, I noticed something strange. The basement door's shadow under the hallway light. It was open again. I grabbed a flashlight and approached slowly. The air smelled damp, foul. I reached the doorway and saw stairs leading into darkness. When I shined the flashlight downward, the beam caught something, a small handprint on the wall, smeared with what looked like mud. Only it wasn't mud. My heart dropped. I ran back into my room and locked the door. The next day, I packed to leave. But before I could go, the police arrived. They were talking to Mrs. Palmer in the driveway. One of them asked if I'd noticed anything unusual. I said no, even though I knew I was lying. Later that evening, I learned what they'd found. Remains of several children buried in the basement, wrapped in towels. Mrs. Palmer had worked as a foster mother in the 1980s. The bodies were decades old. Sometimes, I still dream about that door, how it opened by itself, the smell of damp earth, and those tiny handprints reaching out of the dark. When I first moved into the neighborhood, I was just grateful to have a quiet street after years of city chaos. My new place faced an older house directly across the road, small, pale yellow, with lace curtains always drawn shut. The woman who lived there, Mrs. Devereaux, was the kind of neighbor who smiled too long, but never waved first. She'd just stare until you acknowledged her. The first odd thing happened the week after I moved in. I came home one evening and found a small box on my doorstep. Inside was a porcelain doll, its eyes pale blue and unblinking. There was no note, but across its neck, someone had carved tiny initials. LC, my own. I assumed it was some kind of mix-up and brought it to the house across the street. Mrs. Devereaux opened the door immediately, as though she'd been waiting. "Oh," she said, smiling thinly. "You found her." Before I could respond, she took the doll from my hands and shut the door. After that, I'd catch her watching me from her window at all hours. Sometimes, I'd wake in the middle of the night to see her silhouette behind the curtains, perfectly still, facing my house. I started keeping my blinds closed, but I could still feel her eyes on me. One night, I heard glass shatter. I ran outside and saw that one of my front windows had been broken, but nothing was missing. Instead, on the floor beneath the glass lay the porcelain doll again, this time with its head cracked open and something inside. A lock of dark hair. My hair. I went to the police, but they said there wasn't much they could do without proof. When they knocked on Mrs. Devereaux's door, she didn't answer. They left, and I tried to move on. But over the next few days, the smell started. Faint at first, then stronger. Sweet and sour, like rotting flowers. It drifted from her house, down the street, into my yard. I finally called the authorities again. When they broke down her door, they found her in a chair facing the window, dead for at least a week. The TV was on, playing static. On her lap sat a cracked porcelain doll. The same one, now missing both eyes. Around the house were dozens more dolls, each one with initials carved into its neck. When the police checked their records, they realized those initials matched every resident who'd lived on this street in the last 30 years. That night, I watched as they carried her body out, but when they loaded her into the coroner's van, I saw something fall from the stretcher. The doll. It landed face down on the pavement. When the wind turned it over, I saw that new initials had been carved into its neck. LC. Mine again, freshly cut.